My name is Emma, and I'm about to tell you the story that shattered my entire world. When I tracked my husband's GPS that night, what I discovered made my knees buckle and my heart stop. This wasn't about another woman. This was something far more twisted, something I never could have imagined in my darkest nightmares. You might think you know where this is going, but trust me, you don't. The truth was so shocking that even now, months later, I still wake up in cold sweats replaying that moment when everything I believed crumbled into dust. It all started on a Tuesday evening in late September. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn golden in our quiet London suburb, and life seemed perfectly normal. My husband James had been working late more frequently over the past 3 months. He was a senior architect at Morrison & Associates, a prestigious firm in the city, and I understood that big projects demanded long hours. We'd been married for 7 years, and I trusted him completely. Or at least I thought I did. That particular Tuesday, James texted me around 6 in the evening, saying he'd be working until midnight on the Henderson project. It was a massive commercial development worth millions, and his team was racing against a deadline. I replied with a supportive message, telling him I'd save dinner for him and not to stress too much. Everything seemed routine, almost mundane. I settled onto our cream sofa with a cup of tea, planning to catch up on some reading. Our golden retriever, Bailey, curled up beside me, his warm presence comforting in the empty house. Around 8 o'clock, something strange happened. My friend Sarah called, breathless and worried. She said she'd seen a car that looked exactly like James's silver Mercedes parked outside a pub in Chiswick about 20 minutes from our home. The detail that caught her attention was the distinctive scratch on the rear bumper, the one James got last month when he backed into our garden gate. Sarah wasn't the type to spread gossip or create drama. She was calling because she was genuinely concerned and confused, knowing James had told me he'd be at the office in Canary Wharf, which was in completely the opposite direction. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was another silver Mercedes with a similar scratch. London was full of them. But Sarah's voice carried a weight of certainty that planted a seed of doubt in my mind. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, my tea growing cold in my hands. The rational part of my brain kept saying that there had to be a logical explanation, that James would never lie to me, that our marriage was solid. But another part, a quieter, more insistent voice, whispered that something wasn't right. The frequency of these late nights, the way James had become more protective of his phone lately, how he'd stopped sharing details about his day. Small things I had brushed aside were now assembling into a pattern I couldn't ignore. I tried calling James, but it went straight to voicemail. That wasn't unusual when he was in meetings, but tonight it felt different. I sent him a text asking how work was going, trying to sound casual. No response. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The silence was deafening. Bailey sensed my anxiety and pressed closer against my leg, his brown eyes looking up at me with concern that dogs somehow always managed to express perfectly. That's when I remembered something. 6 months ago, James had installed a family tracking app on both our phones. It was his idea, actually, for safety reasons after a colleague's wife had a car accident and couldn't call for help. The app would show each other's location in real time. We'd barely used it since installation, but it was there, sitting dormant on my phone. My hands trembled as I opened the app, part of me hoping it wouldn't work, that the subscription had expired, that I wouldn't have to face whatever truth was waiting on that screen. The app loaded slowly, each second stretching into eternity. When James's location finally appeared, my breath caught in my throat. The blue dot marking his position wasn't in Canary Wharf where his office stood among the gleaming towers of London's financial district. It wasn't even close. The dot pulsed steadily in Chiswick, right where Sarah had seen his car. My vision blurred and I felt the room begin to spin. He had lied to me. My husband, the man I'd built my life with, had looked me in the eye through that text message and deliberately deceived me. But what happened next was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I watched the blue dot, unable to look away, like watching a car crash in slow motion. James stayed at that location in Chiswick for another 40 minutes. Then the dot began to move. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I expected the dot to head toward home, perhaps with some sheepish excuse about stopping for a drink with colleagues. Instead, it moved deeper into West London, through neighborhoods I barely knew, until it stopped at an address in Hammersmith. I grabbed my laptop and typed the address into Google Maps. What came up on the screen made my blood run cold. It wasn't a hotel, which is what you'd expect in a typical affair scenario. It wasn't a restaurant or bar. It wasn't even a residential building. The address belonged to a private medical clinic. Specifically, according to the small print on their website, it was the Riverside Oncology Center, specializing in cancer treatment and palliative care. My mind went completely blank. Cancer. The word seemed to echo in the empty space of my thoughts. Was James sick? Was that why he'd been distant? Why he'd been lying about working late? But why would he hide something like that from me? We were partners. We'd promised in our vows to face everything together, in sickness and in health. The fear that had been churning in my stomach transformed into something else. A desperate, clawing panic that made it hard to breathe. I grabbed my car keys with shaking hands, barely remembering to lock the door behind me as I rushed out, leaving Bailey barking in confusion. The drive to Hammersmith was a blur. Traffic lights, other cars, the darkening London streets, all of it faded into background noise as my mind raced through possibilities. Was it lung cancer? James had smoked briefly in university but quit years ago. Was it something genetic? His father had died of a heart attack, but there was no cancer in his family history that I knew of. How long had he known? How bad was it? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each one more terrifying than the last. I pulled into the clinic's car park just after 9:30. The building was modern, all glass and steel, with soft lighting that somehow made it look more ominous rather than welcoming. James's Mercedes was parked near the entrance, that telltale scratch on the bumper confirming beyond doubt that it was his. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to gather courage, trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to face. How do you prepare to hear that your husband is dying? How do you walk through those doors knowing your life is about to change forever? I pushed through the clinic's entrance, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. The reception area was quiet, decorated in calming blues and grays, with abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than our car. A young receptionist with kind eyes looked up as I approached. Before I could speak, before I could ask for James Richardson, I heard voices from down the corridor. One of them was James's voice, and he was laughing. Actually laughing. The sound was so unexpected, so jarringly out of place with the scenario I'd built in my mind, that I froze. I followed the sound, walking past treatment rooms with closed doors, past a small waiting area with magazines spread on a coffee table, until I reached a private consultation room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see James. He was sitting in a chair, relaxed, smiling, looking healthier than I'd seen him in months. And sitting across from him, in the patient's chair, was someone I recognized immediately from photos James kept in his office. It was Richard, his best friend from university, the man who'd been best man at our wedding, who'd moved to Australia 5 years ago for work. Richard, who James rarely talked about anymore because, he'd said, they'd drifted apart. But Richard didn't look like the athletic, vibrant man from those old photographs. He looked thin, almost fragile. His skin had a grayish pallor, and he wore a knit cap that couldn't quite hide the fact that he'd lost his hair. Next to him sat a woman I didn't recognize, probably in her early 30s, with tired eyes and a wedding ring that caught the fluorescent light. She was holding Richard's hand, and on her lap sat a little girl, maybe 4 years old, with Richard's eyes and her mother's dark curls. I stood there, invisible in the doorway, as the full picture finally came together. James hadn't been lying about working late for an affair. He'd been lying to protect me from worry, to shield me from the pain of watching his best friend dying of cancer. Richard must have returned from Australia for treatment, probably because the NHS offered something he couldn't get there, or maybe he just wanted to die in the country he'd been born in. James had been visiting him, supporting him through chemotherapy sessions, radiation treatments, all those endless medical appointments that come with fighting cancer. But why the secrecy? Why hadn't James just told me the truth? That question was answered when I heard James speak. He was talking about me, about how I'd been so stressed with my own mother's recent surgery, how I'd barely been sleeping, how he didn't want to add another burden to my shoulders. Richard's wife, whose name I later learned was Sophie, was saying something about how grateful they were for James's help. how he'd been covering some of their medical expenses, how they literally couldn't have afforded treatment without him. That's why James had been working those extra hours at the office legitimately when he wasn't at the clinic, taking on additional projects to earn the money he was quietly funneling to his dying friend. The little girl, whose name was Lily, looked up at James with pure adoration and asked if Uncle James could read her another story next time. James promised he would, his voice thick with emotion, and then he glanced at his watch and said he needed to get home soon because his wife would worry. Richard made a weak joke about me being too good for James anyway, and everyone laughed, though the laughter was edged with sadness, the kind of laughter that happens when people are trying desperately not to cry. I backed away from the door, my entire body numb, my mind struggling to process the cascade of revelations. I'd come here expecting betrayal and found sacrifice instead. I'd prepared myself for confrontation and discovered selflessness. The man I'd doubted, whose GPS I'd tracked like he was a criminal, had been living a secret life, but not the sordid kind I'd imagined. He'd been living the kind of secret life that heroes in stories live, the kind where they sacrifice their own comfort and honesty to protect others. I made it back to my car before the tears came. They weren't tears of relief or even happiness. They were tears of shame, of guilt, of overwhelming love, and of grief for a man I barely knew but who James clearly loved like a brother. I sat there in the dark car park, crying so hard I could barely catch my breath, while my phone showed that blue dot still pulsing inside the clinic, still showing James's location, still offering up secrets I wasn't meant to know. When James came home that night, shortly before midnight just as he'd promised, I was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold in front of me. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes I'd been too blind to really see before. He smiled when he saw me, that familiar, loving smile that had made me fall for him 9 years ago, and asked if I'd waited up for him. I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. Then I told him everything. I told him about Sarah's phone call, about checking the GPS, about driving to the clinic. I told him I'd seen Richard, seen Sophie and Lily, heard every word. I watched his face go through a dozen emotions in seconds: fear, guilt, relief, sadness, all flickering across his features like shadows. When I finished talking, there was a long silence that felt like it lasted hours, but was probably only seconds. James finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He explained that Richard had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. The prognosis was grim, maybe a year if the treatment worked, maybe only months if it didn't. Richard had returned to London because he wanted Lily to grow up knowing her father's homeland, and he wanted access to a particular specialist at the Riverside Center who was pioneering a new treatment protocol. But medical costs were crushing them, even with the NHS covering most of it. The experimental portions weren't covered, and there were so many additional expenses that came with catastrophic illness. James had been helping financially, but he knew I'd insist on helping too if I knew, and we simply couldn't afford it with my mother's care costs and our own mortgage, so he'd been working overtime, taking freelance consulting projects on weekends, skipping lunches to save money, all while spending his evenings either at the office earning extra money or at the clinic supporting Richard through the nightmare of watching your own body fail. He'd met Sophie and Lily dozens of times over the past months, had become Uncle James to a little girl who was going to lose her father far too soon. He'd held Richard's hand through chemotherapy sessions, had listened to his old friend rage and cry and make peace with mortality in turns. He'd been the kind of friend that everyone hopes they have, but few people actually are. And he'd done it all in secret because he loved me too much to let me carry that burden. The shame I'd felt in the car park doubled, then tripled. While James had been living this secret life of compassion and sacrifice, I'd been tracking him like a cheating suspect, building narratives of betrayal in my mind, doubting the integrity of the man who'd never given me actual reason to doubt him. The late-night texts, the phone protection, the distant distraction, all of it had innocent, heartbreaking explanations. He'd been protecting Richard's privacy, shielding me from pain, and carrying a crushing weight alone. I asked James why he hadn't trusted me with the truth, why he thought I couldn't handle it. He looked at me with eyes full of unshed tears and said it wasn't about trust or strength. It was about love. He'd wanted to protect me from the helpless feeling of watching someone die slowly, from the guilt of not being able to do more, from the exhaustion of emotional labor that comes with terminal illness. He knew I would insist on helping, on being there, on carrying my share of the burden, and he'd wanted to spare me that for as long as he could. We sat at that kitchen table until 3 a.m, talking through everything, crying together, and eventually making plans. Plans to meet Richard and Sophie properly, to let me be part of the support system instead of being protected from it. Plans to figure out finances together, to maybe take out a small loan if needed. Plans to make sure Lily had people who'd remember her father when the inevitable happened, who could tell her stories about the brilliant, funny man Richard had been before cancer reduced him to a patient in a chair. 3 months later, Richard passed away on a cold December morning. James was with him at the end, holding his hand while Sophie held the other, and Lily slept in a relative's care, too young to fully understand what was happening. I attended the funeral, standing beside James as he delivered a eulogy that had half the attendees in tears. I watched him be strong for Sophie, watched him play games with Lily to distract her from the grown-ups crying, watched him be the man I'd fallen in love with, but somehow forgotten to see clearly. The GPS tracking incident taught me something profound about trust, about the stories we tell ourselves, about how modern technology gives us access to information without giving us wisdom about what to do with it. I'd had James's location at my fingertips, had concrete data about where he was and what he was doing, and I'd still gotten the story completely wrong. Because location data can't tell you why someone is somewhere. It can't explain motives or reveal character. It can show you dots on a map, but not the human heart behind the journey. That night when I tracked James's GPS, I almost passed out because I thought I was discovering betrayal. The truth was so much more complex and so much more beautiful. I'd discovered that my husband was capable of deeper loyalty, more profound friendship, and greater sacrifice than I'd ever imagined. I'd discovered that sometimes secrets aren't about deception, but about protection. I'd discovered that love sometimes looks like late-night drives to oncology clinics, and quietly emptied savings accounts and lies told not for selfish gain, but to shield someone from pain. Sophie and Lily are part of our lives now. We see them regularly, helping with Lily's school expenses, including her in family gatherings, making sure she grows up knowing her father through stories and photos, and the love of people who cared about him. James set up a trust fund for her education, using money from a bonus he earned on that Henderson project that had been his excuse so many months ago. The irony isn't lost on either of us. Sometimes, late at night when we're lying in bed, I think about that moment in the car park when I saw James's location on my phone screen and felt my world collapse. I think about how wrong I was, how quickly I assumed the worst, how easily trust can be eroded by circumstantial evidence and modern surveillance capabilities. I think about the fact that technology has given us unprecedented access to each other's whereabouts, to each other's communications, to each other's lives, but it hasn't given us the wisdom to interpret that information correctly. The GPS tracking app is still on both our phones, but I've never opened it again. I don't need to know James's exact location at every moment. I need to trust the man I married, to believe in his integrity, to remember that sometimes the most suspicious circumstances hide the most beautiful truths. I learned that lesson the hard way, standing outside an oncology clinic in Hammersmith, listening to my husband laugh with his dying friend, and promised to read stories to a little girl who was about to become fatherless. If you're reading this story because you're thinking about tracking your partner's location, because something feels off and you're looking for answers, I want you to consider something carefully. The information you find might not mean what you think it means. The dots on the map can't tell you about the human experiences happening at those locations. They can't reveal the complexity of choices people make or the reasons behind their actions. Sometimes the truth is darker than you fear, but sometimes it's brighter than you could imagine. And if you do discover something unexpected, if you find your partner somewhere they said they wouldn't be, please consider having a conversation before jumping to conclusions. Give them the chance to explain, to tell their side of the story, to share the context that GPS coordinates can never provide. Because sometimes what looks like betrayal is actually the deepest kind of loyalty, and sometimes what seems like a lie is actually love wearing a different face. My husband said he'd work late, and when I tracked his GPS, I almost passed out. Not because of what I found, but because of what I almost missed. I almost missed the chance to see him clearly, to understand the depth of his character, to be part of something meaningful and heartbreaking and ultimately beautiful. I almost let technology and fear and assumption rob me of the truth. I'm grateful every day that I didn't. The blue dot on that screen showed me James's location, but it took walking through those clinic doors to discover where his heart truly was. And his heart, I learned that night, was exactly where it had always been. Exactly where it belonged, in all the right places, doing all the right things, for all the right reasons. I'd just been looking at the map instead of at the man.